Good morning, everyone. Here we go again. Happy Tuesday. Hope everyone enjoyed the winter storm and is able to dig out from the snow, which didn't come. If you want snow this winter, I guess you have to go to the West Coast. So this morning, we're going to be taking a look at the subject of officiating at a Jewish wedding. Can just anyone officiate at Jewish weddings? And the idea comes from a headline for a recent New York state law. It's reported on in source number one from the StatenIslandLive.com website. It was reported in other places. Newsday. I'll be honest, I tried to get the Newsday copy, but I don't want to subscribe to it. That's one of the things they can still do online and prevent you from reading what you want to read by making you subscribe. Anyway, the information is out there from the government, the New York State website, but this is a brief blurb describing it. In late March 2023, just a month away, any adult will be able to apply to officiate a wedding in New York State, opening the door for family, friends, or just about anyone to help the betrothed tie the knot. That privilege was previously only afforded clergy, judges, and elected officials in the Empire State. But Governor Kathy Hochul changed all that on December 28th when she signed the bill into law, paving the way for adults to apply for a one-day officiant license to marry a couple in the state. Previously, friends and family members seeking to officiate a wedding ceremony in the state were required to become ordained ministers to do so. The one-day designation presents a secular option for those who do not wish to be ordained within a specific church, but wish to perform a ceremony. Makes it easier for friends or family members to have that honor. In the past, couples also had the option of hiring a wedding officiant if they were not members of a church. Right, so it's kind of, there was a time when I think it was really before COVID, the New York Times would list I had many more weddings listed. And it was very contemporary and current, and they had the weddings of that day, of that weekend. And, there was a trend, as a rabbi and a student of human nature, there are a couple of trends I followed. One is, unfortunately, how many intermarriages were taking place, with the rabbi taking part or the priest taking part of the ceremony. But another trend was the fact that fewer and fewer clergy were officiating, and it was this idea of so-and-so was ordained as a temporary Unitarian or Universalist or humanity clergy for the day. And, that's what people would do. It's pretty straightforward to get your religious ordination online. Mentions here only a church, but the same thing is true within Judaism. There's a lot of things that you can get online or virtually or temporarily. They used to sometimes joke about, there was a time when there was a proliferation of ordinations, especially during the Vietnam War, where there were many more divinity students. They kind of coined the joke that, you can get ordination with a couple of box tops from breakfast cereal and send that in and get your ordination. So I don't think it necessarily got that bad, but there's this idea you could just be ordained for the day or temporarily, and now that you won't even have to do that. So you have this option, and really, from a Jewish perspective, what we're going to unpack is who officiates, what are the qualifications for officiating, what does that mean, what happens if the wrong person officiates, or if there is no general clergy or officiant officiation, right? Let's say, on some level here, the friend in New York State now, anyone could really do it, anyone over 18. And how does that play if that was the case in a Jewish situation, if there was really no officiant? As well as what's the status of weddings that aren't necessarily officiated or officiated properly. So we're going to sort of unpack that step by step. So it's really, who officiates, what does it mean to officiate? What happens if there is no officiation? Are those people married? And we'll see, obviously we can think of, scenarios how this would apply, whether it's Orthodox, whether it's non-Orthodox. We'll try to tackle some of that as well as any other questions which emerge. In general, as the article mentions, it used to be clergy, right? In some places, New York City, for example, you had to be a registered officiant. Clergy is not enough. In many places, the officiating rabbi is able to sign the marriage license form, send that in, the person will get a marriage license, because the religious ceremony will count for it to be a civil ceremony, and it will be solemnized and authorized, etc. New York City, you have to be a registered officiant. You sign up. You have to sign up and be registered, and you have to send in a copy of your ordination. It's not a big deal, but it's a step that has to be taken. Also, can limit the officiants who are living officiants in New York City weddings, because they have to be registered officiants. So, for example, you can end up in a situation where a person will turn to the rabbi to officiate religiously, but they won't be able to officiate civilly. That they'd have to find someone else to do it. I was recently at a wedding where I was there to sign the marriage license. It oversees, since I was there for the chuppah, that the ceremony took place, and I was able to authenticate that piece. Also, technically, it is illegal for a religious ceremony to take place without a civil ceremony. It's against the law for that to take place. I believe in every single state. You can't have you can't have one without the other. And religious ceremonies, as we see, for the most part, count. New York City is a place not so, but that may actually be changing. On some level now, you really have no excuse not to have a civil officiation done legally, because any person there in attendance can technically be the civil officiant. All they have to do is register. I don't really know what the fee is. I'm sure it's not that much. But, so this, in a way, provides many more options. It could also make it a little bit easier. People have rabbis come in from Israel to officiate, and they're not really as familiar with the civil ceremony. And, and if you're getting married in Manhattan, you have to find a rabbi who's an officiant. This can make things a lot easier for those who are trying to check off all those boxes. So we'll launch into some of these Jewish questions. But first, any reactions, questions, comments from the presentation of this new innovation, or questions on the topic in general before we dive into the sources?
Rabbi?
Yes.
The answer to your question, I'll put this.
Can't hear you, Al. All right. Well, feel free to ask once the audio gets restored. So let's just dive in. What does it mean to be an officiant at a wedding? The whole concept. So the term is called misader kiddushin. Literally means to arrange the kiddushin. What is kiddushin? Kiddushin is the first part of a wedding ceremony. When you have a marriage, you have usually there has been, before the kiddushin, before the marriage takes place, there has been an agreement that they're going to get married. That's called a tanayim. It's really an engagement. Tanayim are stipulations, and sometimes this is represented at the Jewish wedding itself by, it's most known by the mothers of the bride and groom breaking a plate. Really, that's a ceremony that has established that the fathers or their designees of the bride and the groom are assuring that the bride and groom will show up for the wedding. Now, to have that take place on the day of the wedding is a little bit unnecessary, because, right, unless someone's going to make a break for it between the smorgasbord and the chuppah, you're not really going to have that situation. But it is a custom. These tanayim documents were usually filled out months in advance, 6 months in advance, a year in advance, whenever the engagement took place, and then there would be a little bit more of a risk involved, because a lot can happen in a year. But now it really is just a holdover to that. It's not a necessary document. As I often tell couples getting married, it's really a photo op, or an opportunity for there to be a little bit more participation by others in the ceremony, whether it be the witnesses to the document, or reading the document, or giving the mothers a chance to break a plate. In case you're wondering why break a plate, all sorts of reasons given. One that I feel makes a lot of sense is that it's going to happen. The likelihood is, over the course of a marriage and a connection of bringing these two families together, at some point there'll be a broken plate or a spill or something like that in the course of the wedding. We get that out of the way early. See, we broke a plate. Whatever's going to come next, we'll be able to manage as well. But that's the tanayim, and that's really an appendage to the Jewish marriage ceremony. You have the kiddushin, which is really the marriage. That's the giving of the ring, right? The giving of a proper a ring that's the groom owns and gives to the bride, and the bride accepts as is in the presence of two halachically valid witnesses. And he makes his intent and declaration known that you were betrothed to me with this ring in accordance with the laws of Moses and Israel. That being witnessed is how the couple is married. And then after that, you have this celebration, the Nisuin, which represents married life together, which is the Sheva Brachos that are recited under the chuppah. Afterwards, there's some have the custom of yichud, Ashkenazim, the custom of yichud, that they're spending time alone together, and Mazel Tov. So you have those two parts. And the marriage part, the first part, the Kiddushin, it has a lot of details in terms of the witnesses, in terms of the ring, in terms of everyone having the right intent. And so therefore, there is often the Misadir Kiddushin. And not only is it the ceremony, but there are brachos recited over the ceremony. It's interesting that usually in contemporary parlance, the Misadir Kiddushin is the one who will say those two blessings, right? After the bride enters and walks around 7 times, they sometimes will announce the officiating rabbi, the Misadir Kiddushin is, and he might say a few words, and then he'll say the two brachot, Borei Pri Hagafen over a cup of wine, and then the bracha of Kiddushin, which is a little bit of a longer blessing than we're used to. It begins with the words Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al ha'arayos v'yasar lanu es ha'rusos v'hitir lanu es ha'nesuos lanu al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin baruch atah Hashem mekadesh amo Yisrael al yedei chuppah v'kiddushin, which essentially the translation is that God has sanctified us and commanded us about only being able to establish a home with a wife after she has been betrothed with this ceremony, and that's when the marriage begins, and we have this chuppah and kiddushin. And so that is those two blessings, usually recited by the officiating rabbi. Technically, it can be recited by anybody who's making the brachos, just like the Sheva bracha, but usually that's how we distinguish who the officiating rabbi is. So, part of it is who gets to say those brachos, who are those brachos for, what kind of bracha is it, which will take us into a situation of who can recite those brachos, who can officiate over the marriage, and what happens if there's no proper officiation. So the Rambam, Maimonides, says about these brachos, this first part of the Kiddushin, whenever a man consecrates a woman, whether by himself or via an agent, right, the Talmud is full of a situation that if I can send someone as my agent to betroth a woman, right, I can give the shaliach, the agent, the ring and say, give this ring to so-and-so, and on my behalf say that she is betrothed to me. And that technically, Kiddushin al yedei shliach is something that exists and was more common. I don't think we really have that today. It would be kind of strange to have the shliach there doing the Kiddushin, but whoever is doing the act of consecration, whether the person or agent, either he or his agent should recite a blessing before the consecration, as one recites a blessing before performing any of the mitzvot. After reciting the blessing, he should consecrate the woman. If he consecrates a woman without reciting a blessing, he should not recite the blessing afterwards. It would be a blessing in vain for the activity that has already been performed. Really, what the Rambam is saying here is that this blessing is the blessing over a mitzvah. So, for example, just like you make a bracha before you put up a mezuzah, you make a bracha before you marry a woman, and there is a mitzvah to get married. Is it a mitzvah specifically to get married? Is this part of the mitzvah of Peru or Vu, being fruitful and multiply, building a family? There's a discussion about, but for the Rambam, it's a bracha that you say before performing a mitzvah. And if the act of consecration takes place without the bracha, it's too late. You can't make the bracha afterwards. So the Rambam's understanding is that this bracha is a bracha of a mitzvah. Who says that bracha? According to the Rambam, really for the Rambam, the only one who can say that bracha is the man or his agent, because it's their bracha. So for the Rambam, this whole idea of there being an officiating rabbi or someone else is basically foreign, because the bracha is for the person performing the mitzvah. And in that case, it could be him or his agent. So the bracha is a bracha of a mitzvah. Now, not everyone agrees with the Rambam for a couple of reasons. One, if you heard the blessing that was recited, it's not a standard bracha, right? What is a bracha of a mitzvah? Right? Think of a blessing over Shabbos candles. Or the bracha of tzitzis, al mitzvah tzitzis. The bracha here over the kiddushin is not al mitzvah kiddushin or likadesh isha. It's a longer, more poetic, prosaic expression of the relationship that's about to take place. So we have here Rabbeinu Asher, and he and others follow this view. Source number 3 He says, this bracha ain't no bracha la'asiyas ha-mitzvah. It's not a bracha over a mitzvah, right? Because, anything, if it's about being fruitful and multiply, that's not happening here. And he says, fruitful and multiply, you don't have to have a wife, right? Technically, according to Jewish law, there is a concept of a concubine. You can have multiple wives. So this action right here is not an action of a mitzvah. Therefore, the bracha zu, the second line in the bold, nistkena laseh shevach lahakadosh baruch hu, is there to praise Hashem, that God has commanded us with his mitzvos, and he has separated us from other nations and given us a framework through which our relationships are sanctified. We don't just grab women by the hair and club them and take them home. We have a religious obligation that comes with responsibilities, and that's what the bracha is for. The bracha is a bracha of thanksgiving, a bracha of praise. Now, if this is a blessing of praise over the action that's taking place, who can recite that blessing? Technically, that blessing can be recited by anyone who's present. It's not a bracha of the mitzvah for the man getting married. It's a bracha for anyone who's present to say over the fact that they're getting married. And this is an approach that would really, facilitate there being someone who is officiating saying the bracha, right? It's not a very long jump to get from, well, the bracha has to be recited. There's a lot of people there. Who should say the bracha? Well, there's a lot going on. That's why you have a misader, someone who makes the arrangements, and that person should be responsible for the bracha because he, like everyone else there, is thanking God for this wonderful mitzvah taking place. So you have for the Rambam, it's a bracha on a mitzvah. It's really for the person performing the mitzvah. For the Rosh, it's a blessing of praise and thanksgiving, which expands the pool of those who can say the bracha. It could also be the groom too, but it's certainly for the Rambam, it's harder to have someone else say it. And for the Rosh, it's really for everyone. So according to the Shulchan Aruch, source number 4, all who betroth a woman, whether in person or through an agent, recites the blessing. Here is agent. The Shulchan Aruch, Mechaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, really sounds like the Rambam. Who's saying the bracha? The groom or the agent of the groom? Ramah, there are those who say that another should recite a blessing, and so it is customary. It's for the Ramah, it's really someone else can say it. There is this idea of an officiant. Seemingly, that relies somewhat on the Rosh's opinion. So essentially, practically speaking, is this a bracha of a mitzvah or is this a bracha of praise? From the Shulchan Aruch, it seems that it's more the bracha for a mitzvah. For the Ramah, it opens up the possibility it's a bracha for praise. And Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem in the 1950s and 60s, that when we would then, for the sake of not embarrassing the groom who cannot recite the bracha himself, recite a blessing for naught by having the rabbi recite a blessing which is not his to make. Rather, one must conclude that in truth, our practice goes against Rambam's position because we adopt the position that the bracha is not specifically the groom's obligation. Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank is trying to understand how we get to this idea of an officiating rabbi and feels that it must be that the bracha isn't, like the Rambam says, a bracha of a mitzvah, it's a bracha of praise and thanks, and therefore we're very comfortable just giving it to the officiating personality. Now, I did, I don't know if anyone noticed on the reminder email that went out at 8 a.m., asked the question, what about a woman reciting this blessing? So if the blessing is a mitzvah blessing, well, the mitzvah is on the man and not on the woman. Just like the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply falls upon the man, even though the woman is essential to the process. If it's a mitzvah blessing, there's no possibility for a woman to say it and to assume that type of a role under the chuppah. According to the Rosh's position, and the way Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank understands that our practice is based on the blessing being one of praise, there might be some room to facilitate that. The idea of a woman reciting those blessings, because they're there for anyone. Now, this was not addressed by any of the earlier authorities. I think that for the most part, the Ramah saying that another reciting a blessing is so it is customary seems to be describing the fact that, and as we will see, the idea of an officiant emerges from the complexity of a chuppah. And we'll see that in a minute, because right now we're just talking about what's taking place. What is the Sidur Kiddushin? Next, we'll have to talk about who can officiate over it. But with regards to the bracha, even if it's shevach v'hodah, it seems that the Ramah is invoking this idea of there being an officiant, and that officiant being the community rabbi, and seemingly putting it in the domain of it is a rabbi. Now, what kind of a rabbi and who is a rabbi is another conversation. But for the most part, we can understand why, even if it's a bracha of shevach v'hodah, it never really turned into the domain of a woman, whether because the women were never rabbis, whether it be because women did not take this public role, or a host of reasons, sociologically as well as halachically. But there is that opening. Now, for the most part, I think that the consensus of the halachic opinion is Shulchan Aruch follows the Rambam. The Ramah opens up the possibility of it's also shevach v'hodah, because this has become customary, because the idea of an officiant has emerged. And Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank endorses that idea that an officiant has emerged, and that's strange because from the Rambam there can't be an officiant. The bracha is for the chassan, for his designee, but Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank is not discussing this with to open up the birchas erusin to the entire community, male and or female. But he's there to try and understand how we can get to an officiant if the Rambam would seem to forestall that possibility. But it seems that, if we're talking about what's taking place in this bracha and what is the role of a Mesader Kiddushin, primarily it's seen as the one saying the bracha. We're trying to get from point A to point B does often involve seeing this as a bracha of shevach, which allows for someone else to say it. And now we're going to have to pivot towards what does it mean to be an officiant, because essentially what seems to emerge from the discussion, starting with the Talmud and then the earlier and later authorities, is that the officiation is really more of the details that you don't really follow so much in terms of having ensured that the couple is allowed to marry each other. They're both Jewish. They're both born of Jewish mothers. The witnesses are all valid. The ketubah is filled out properly, and so the officiation, while publicly understood as the rabbi who's up there speaking or saying these brachos, really has a lot more to do with other details, which we'll see in a minute. But we have to just start off by understanding what is going on at a kiddushin, and then we can go to what's going on behind the scenes at a kiddushin. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Rabbi, pursuant to halacha, can a woman be a rabbi?
Can what?
Can a woman be a rabbi?
So it's a longer conversation. It depends what we mean by rabbi and what is the definition of a rabbi. If the rabbi is merely a title, then you could be a rabbi. Everyone could be a rabbi. If the rabbi has a certain communal functioning role, as we will see, there may be certain aspects that the specific job description of that could forestall a woman from being a rabbi, like reading Torah or leading a service, or even possibly not being able to officiate because the blessing is a bracha of a mitzvah that doesn't apply. The mitzvah doesn't apply to a woman. Then you get into the sociology and the communal standards aspect of it, in terms of whether they sometimes invoke the idea that we know from the Torah and from the Gemara and from the idea that women are not given positions of authority, and so a woman can't be a queen, she can't be a king, she can't be a monarch, a ruler. So the people who say women can't be rabbis because of that, I think, overestimate how much power rabbis really have. But for the most part, the traditional halachic approach forestalls women from taking on the role of community rabbi. How much of that is communal norm? Part of it is. There are some communities that have, that is being a rabbi an official title, or is it clergy? Right? Clergy is a more broad term that seemingly is open to men and women. And the question is, the terminology, where people are comfortable. I think the more widespread approach in the Orthodox community is not for women to be rabbis. I do think that it has been discussed, significantly, especially in the modern Orthodox community, having women study a course of study that's similar to what rabbis study, and to have be recognized for that study, or to graduate in the same way that rabbis are trained. There's a lot more openness. There's just seems to be a bit of a taboo on the title. is it a halachic taboo, or is it a more community structure and policy taboo? I think it's more the latter. I always like the idea that within the Orthodox community, we're trying to maintain some level that we're one broader Orthodox community with different shades of more modern or more traditional. And I like to give the example that always growing up until this day, we would always go to Eichler's in Brooklyn to do some Judaica shopping and the like. And the guy who runs the book department there is a pretty Orthodox guy with a beard and nice Yiddish accent, and not necessarily would never necessarily identify as modern Orthodox. And I always give the example, like if you're going to order a set of chumash, a set of chumashim for a bar bat mitzvah, and he's there wrapping the gift for you, and you're just making chit chat. It's like, oh, what's this? A gift for? Oh, they're very nice. Oh, what shul? And you mention shul. Oh, who's your rabbi? And saying that your rabbi is the rabbi of an Orthodox shul is a woman, that would kind of like blow his mind. Just because so there's a certain sociological element as well as a technical one, and that's why I think in the Orthodox community you don't have a phenomenon of women rabbis. You have rabbanits, and you have educators, and you have yoatzot halacha advisors. You have clergy, but I think you don't have Orthodox female rabbis as a widespread phenomenon at this time. And look, that's on one foot, a much larger conversation. But for those who, some of you may have heard, we had the Rabbanit Shani Tarragon presented on that in Atlantic Beach last Memorial Day weekend. But that's, I guess, the short answer to your question.
Thank you.
All right, so that's with the idea of what the kiddushin is really the bracha of the kiddushin, which opens up to has often been assigned to the officiant, because that's who's overseeing everything else, and that is the officiant can do so in some sort of combination of it's a bracha of the mitzvah, but it's also an element of praise. So therefore, maybe he's designated by the groom to do this, that allows him to say the bracha. So what about officiation in general? So the Gemara in Kiddushin 13a, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, source 6, anyone who does not know the nature of bills of divorce and betrothal should have no dealings in them, as his ignorance might lead people to commit serious sins. Right? We treat the laws of family, which are predicated upon marriage and divorce, right? Who can marry whom, and who, making sure the wedding is done properly, and if there has to be a divorce, that a divorce be done properly, needs to be done by experts. And that's why the details are sweated significantly in terms of the writing of the ketubah and the names and the like. And as seriously as it is taken for weddings, even more so for divorces, where locations are not just mentioned, but which rivers they're near are mentioned, and names are not just mentioned, the Hebrew names of the parties involved and their parents, but also any nicknames they may have. So if you have someone whose Hebrew name is Ruvain ben Avraham, but his name is Richard, so he'll be Ruvain ben Avraham, who's also known as Richard, who might be sometimes called Rich, who's sometimes called Richie. They go really out into the weeds to be very specific, because Jewish families are dependent on these laws. So the Gemara Kiddushin says if someone doesn't know those laws, can't officiate. Okay. Shulchan Aruch, anyone who is not an expert in the makeup of divorce and marriages should not deal with them, to teach about them, because it is easy to err and to permit the forbidden woman and cause an increase in mamzerim, children born from illicit relationships in Israel. So this isn't just the Talmud using this within the context of making arguments, but it's there to say that it is only allowed for someone who is an expert to be involved in this. Okay, so who's expert? What kind of expert? By whose criteria? So the Taz points out that, look, with regards to Kiddushin, marriages, there aren't many details, and details that require legal rulings are not present there. And so is the custom among us to honor with Sidur Kiddushin, officiating, even one who's not a great scholar. At the end of the day, marriages are not as complex as divorces. So the Taz is saying, yes, we want someone who knows what they're doing, but it's not such a big deal. You don't need there's an expression, Rashka Bahag. You know what a Rashka Bahag is? Anybody ever hear that expression? Rashka Bahag is a abbreviation for Rosh Kol B'nai Hagolah, a term of honor given to the rabbi who is the head of the entire diaspora. really someone who's, universally acclaimed and accepted. So we like to say, you don't need to be a Rosh Bahag. You don't need to be the Gadol Hador to officiate at weddings. When it comes to divorces, we want to make sure you have more experience and more knowledge, but weddings are not such a big deal. Why do you think can someone think of a reason why we're also not as particular about weddings? It's going to be relevant to what happens when a wedding is not properly officiated. Yeah.
I think because some of the other things, a marriage is, there's this kesef, there's just the yichud. Those are the things that are really...
Right. So part of it will emerge from the fact that, and we're going to come to this next, if you have man and woman and they live together and have children, how do we describe them? Married. They're a family, right? Common law. This is kind of we're gonna see in a little bit. There's certain assumptions can be made and are halachically valid when they are made, and that's what makes people married more than which rabbi officiated and which details he got right and wrong. So the Taz is more forgiving in terms of who can officiate. The Piskei Tshuva, commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, source number 9, definitely it wasn't for naught that these generations were accustomed to only give away the honor of Mesider Kedushin with the permission of a Rav, because there are many stumbling blocks to worry about, such as forbidden relationships who get married, which happens sometimes in our generation, right? Because you're already getting into the 18th and 19th century where people weren't as observant, and there's a whole host of questions about officiating for a non-observant man and woman, if it's even allowed, because they're not necessarily going to live a proper Jewishly married life. Knesset Hagdola, in a responsa, writes that it is an enactment of the French rabbis. French rabbis usually is our Ashkenazic forebears, which were in the days of Rabbeinu Tam, that they decreed that only someone who was chosen to be a Rav can be Mesader Kedushin, or who is this halachic decisive for a community. Right, there is the idea, and this, also, factors into, who can be officiating, but they said it has to be a rabbi. So this is an enactment, a takana, of the Ashkenazi community, that it has to be a rabbi. It has to be someone who's who answers questions of Jewish law. And there's a whole discussion in the rabbinic literature. Is it the rabbi of the community? Let's say it's a rabbi from another community. Does he have to ask permission of the rabbi of the community where the wedding's at, right? This kind of resonates a little bit, that if, sometimes if you use a synagogue as a wedding hall, that you have to use the rabbi there as the officiating rabbi. And what happens if you don't want to? Usually there's a fee anyway for the rabbi because it's his makom, right? That's not just kind of a caterer shtick. That's really based on the idea that if you're in a place, that rabbi has to be the officiating rabbi. So you have to ask permission or pay him off to use somebody else. So the Piskei Tshuva, quoting this view of the Ashkenazic rabbis, the Knesset Hagdola, there is a halachic path to the construction towards it has to be a rabbi, and it has to be the local rabbi, and it has, so therefore you need someone who has, he is more concerned even with the marriages, also for the reasons I mentioned before. There are lots of details, and therefore, while the Taz is recognizing that marriage details are not necessarily as serious as divorce details, he doesn't have to be a great scholar. At the same time, from another direction, there are those who say it has to be a rabbi. It has to be the local rabbi. It has to be someone who's able to answer halachic questions. So, in this respect, we can see how the significance of the officiating rabbi, the Mesader Kiddushin, has emerged. Right? We saw that there is this, the first step is to identify that someone else can make the brachos, right? We saw from the Rambam that isn't necessarily so simple, but utilizing the thinking of the Russians and moving it forward, that so you have the brachos recited by someone else, and that someone else has to know the laws of Kiddushin, and there is certainly a strong communal practice of it being a rabbi. And so this is how this would fly against Governor Hochul's the rule that anyone can be an officiant. From a civil perspective, yes. From a halachic perspective and a Jewish tradition perspective, there seems to be a need for there to be a rabbi, at least certainly a rabbi overseeing the process, right? The sources don't really tell us who can say those blessings, but it tells us that the person supervising that process, according to a very strong tradition or even a takana among Ashkenazim, has to be a rabbi. Questions, comments, reactions. So now the question is, what happens if it was not done properly? What happens if Joe Schmo officiated? Does that impact the status of the marriage? Or what if there is no rabbi? Like we said before, so the Gemara, source number 10 is a Mishnah Gemara in Gittin, which talks about a man who divorces his wife and afterwards she spends the night with him at an inn. Right? So they're both together in the same place. You don't know what's going on. Beis Shammai says she doesn't require a second bill of divorce. And Beis Hillel says she requires a second bill of divorce. They may have engaged in sexual intercourse at the end, and therefore I betrothed her once again. Okay, so Beis Hillel there seems to be making certain assumptions, and the Gemara explores those assumptions. Beis Hillel hold a person does not engage in licentious sexual intercourse. Therefore, he had the intention to betroth her. He must give her another bill of divorce. Right? So just because you have a man and a woman secluded in one place, even if there is a sexual relationship, who says that that's for marriage, right? Passion overtook them. Beis Hillel says that doesn't happen. People don't just engage in having a good time. If they're having a sexual relationship, it has to be for a purpose of marriage, and therefore he and she were there, and they were secluded. And if they had a relationship, you have to assume that it was for the purpose of creating a marriage. Okay, that's if someone saw or knows that there was a sexual relationship. But what about the case that you didn't see that she engaged in sexual intercourse? Right, this is usually not something which is witnessed, right? But there are no witnesses. So there's a case where the witnesses know that they were alone together in the space, but what about witnesses? There are no witnesses to the actual action. So Beis Shammai here holds, we do not say the witnesses of seclusion are the witnesses for the intercourse. The expression would be in the Talmud that there are Eidei Yichud, witnesses to the seclusion, and Eidei Bia, witnesses to the sexual act. So Beis Shammai says, Hein Eidei Yichud v'lo Eidei Bia. There might be seclusion witnesses, but they're not witnesses to the intercourse. But Beis Hillel, and this is the bolded lines in the end of source 10, we do say that these are the witnesses of seclusion. These are the witnesses of sexual intercourse. Hein Eidei Yichud, Hein Eidei Bia. You see him go in. Beis Hillel really feels that there's no possibility that if they're alone together, that there was no intercourse, and therefore Beis Hillel says they go in together in a space. They're secluded. They're not going to have any type of sexual relationship that's outside of the context of marriage. Now they are married. They have to get remarried. So again, how this plays out halachically, and for the most part, we don't encounter these types of cases the same way anymore. We probably don't even have these types of witnesses to seclusion, but this was the case in the Talmud that presents us with, wait a second, we have, going back to the situation we described briefly earlier, you have a man, you have a woman, they're in a house together. Based on that idea, who cares who officiated, right? The case in the Mishnah and the Gemara didn't involve officiation of a marriage. It says that they're going to be married. They're going to require a Jewish divorce because they were alone together. So what if you have a man and a woman who are living together and they're having children, they're having a family? Who cares? Maybe they had the wrong rabbi officiate. Maybe they had no rabbi officiate. Is that still viewed as a marriage? So, how did this idea get discussed, in Jewish history? For the most part, you didn't have Jews getting civilly married. You didn't have as many of these opportunities that would emerge in Jewish law. But the Shulchan Aruch does quote a situation which is analogous. Source number 11, regarding a man and woman who were forcibly converted and later married in a Gentile ceremony. Right? So let's say here you have a case of a Jewish man, Jewish woman, forcibly converted. Even though everyone Jewish sees them entering their home alone, right? Just like the situation in the Mishnah and the Gemara, Beit Hillel, no Kiddushin exists between this man and woman. You don't have Kiddushin. And they don't require, therefore, a get. And so this is an important source for the opinion of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. For people who had only civil marriage, who are halachically observant, the couple requires a get because of the rule, Ein Adam Osa Bilato Bilat Znut, because of the fact that, look, if they're observant and they're living together, they clearly don't want their relationship to be just having a good time. They want it to be within the context of something real and married. If it is possible, one should obtain a get, even for those couples who are not halachically observant. But what if they're not halachically observant? They don't care about the rules. They just had a marriage similar to the Jewish man and woman who had a Catholic marriage or a Gentile marriage, right? As they should have a get. However, if it is impossible to obtain a get and the woman would otherwise remain naguna, one might rely on the lenient ruling of the Rivash. Civil marriage, not observant, they don't seem to be connected to Jewish community, or they're not interested in Jewish observance. Civil marriage for Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is not viewed as kiddushin, as religiously married, and does not require a divorce if you can't get one. A get is always the best step forward. Anytime you have man, woman living together, get is appropriate. But if you are not able to do that and you have man, woman completely non-observant, civil marriage for Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is not halachically kiddushin, religious marriage, and therefore a divorce is not absolutely required if you can't get one. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was opposed on this subject by Rabbi Eliyahu Henkin, who was an older contemporary of Rabbi Feinstein who had been in America a little bit earlier. He was the founder here of Ezra's Torah. If anyone ever sees those little Jewish calendars, that was his organization. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham and answered questions. He was overshadowed by Rabbi Feinstein as the more common destination for questions and answers being accepted, but Rabbi Henkin was completely opposed to this and felt that if you would allow that woman to remarry without a get and she would have children, you would encounter a mamzer illegitimate situation. But for the most part, as Rabbi Meshulam Roth, the more contemporary rabbi in Israel, points out, virtually all the great halachic authorities of the previous generation agree that a couple which was married only in a civil ceremony essentially does not require a get. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's view has been accepted because it's sound halacha, but also very relevant to more civil marriages you end up with. In Israel, for example, where people go to Cyprus to have a civil marriage, they still, if they want to get divorced, the only divorce they have in Israel is a get. So in Israel, you don't really have this option because marriage and divorce in Israel are only done religiously. If you have a civil marriage, you still need the religious divorce because that's the way the system works. But that is, so with regards to what if if there is no officiation, well, if there is no officiation, then if the couple is not observant, the question comes up, what if they become more observant? They want to be Balei Tshuva. Hopefully, if they're Balei Tshuva, they're going to want to do a religious divorce at the end anyway. But here you have, if there's no officiation, it's very possible that no religious officiation, then it's not necessarily a religious marriage if we're talking about a couple that's a little bit distant. Questions or comments before we look at improper officiation?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Naturally, the conservative and reform parts of Judaism have completely different requirements.
Right. So that's the next situation that comes up, and Rabbi Feinstein addresses that as well. You look at source 13, it's actually 14. They're numbered incorrectly, but source number 14. It appears correct to me that a marriage ceremony conducted by a reform rabbi has no halachic validity. If a thorough investigation demonstrates that two qualified witnesses did not see the groom hand the bride the ring and recite the traditional formula of "you're betrothed to me," he goes on to say that there's another deficiency in a reform wedding ceremony. Source 14, they do not perform an act of kiddushin. Rather, he merely responds, yes, right? His experience, Rabbi Feinstein's experience in 60s and 70s was that the reform ceremony was very much done more in a secular way. Do you take so-and-so to be your husband? Do you take so-and-so to be your wife? These are the words of kiddushin. These are not words of kiddushin, right? Rather, these express consent to joining in marriage. The man and woman subsequently exchange rings at the discretion of their marriage, which they believe to have been contracted already by answering yes. Even though he gives her a ring, she also gives him a ring, which demonstrates that his giving her a ring merely a present, and there was no act of kiddushin. Essentially, Rabbi Feinstein says that even if there's a type of religious officiation and a giving of a ring from the groom to the bride, either you're missing valid witnesses or you're missing the proper intent that has to be involved in the groom's giving the ring and the bride's accepting the ring. And therefore, he feels that reform marriages, wedding ceremonies are no better than civil ceremonies, and therefore no get would be required. Now, it's interesting, Rabbi Feinstein specifically talks about reform. Conservative would likely be different because conservative movement is much more halachic in its approach to Judaism. They've made certain changes which are made, based on history, but it is possible that a conservative ceremony, a conservative officiation, you have to analyze it and study to see whether or not the right halachic processes were followed. It's a little bit more complicated and has much more of a halachic look and feel. And it's just a question of some of the other pieces. I know, for example, that weddings that have been officiated at by conservative rabbis. In the case in question that I'm familiar with, and I've dealt with a male conservative rabbi who himself was was a Shomer Shabbos, and all of the witnesses were Orthodox individuals. That kiddushin was determined a good kiddushin. Because it met all the criteria, it checked off the halachic boxes that Rabbi Feinstein does not see in Reform, and generally are not the case, but conservative they may sometimes be, so it could be a little bit more complex. So we have the idea that no officiation may lead to no kiddushin, and the idea that improper kiddushin may lead to no valid kiddushin. As always is the case, since we're very careful about family law, a get is always a good idea, but really if there's no kiddushin, then there's no get required. And for the most part, these are all parts of the reasons why a proper officiation becomes necessary, and why we don't let just anybody officiate on the religious side of things. And if it's done improperly, could really call into question the whole Jewish validity of the marriage ceremony. And so can just anyone officiate? Not from a religious perspective. Civilly, have as much fun as you want. And but in New York now, you can have a very simple path to civil officiation by anybody and everyone. Religiously, much more complicated in that the fact that the kiddushin requires a commitment and a following of the kedusha practices involving the officiation, the bracha, the witnesses, and the like, which make it much more complicated. End of the day, mazel tov to everybody getting married.